They say life ain't fair, and mostly they're right. But it ain't just about the hand you're dealt, it's about what you do with it. Most folks, they got dreams, big ones, tucked away like old lottery tickets in a forgotten wallet. Dreams of a different life, a little more breathing room, a little more joy, a little less worry when the first of the month rolls around. They watch others, folks who seem to have it all, and they wonder, how'd they do it? What's their secret? Were they just born lucky? And the truth, the real, gritty, unvarnished truth, it ain't no secret. Not a magic spell, not some golden ticket that just falls into your lap. The real secret is usually staring us right in the face every single morning when the alarm blares its ugly tune, every single evening when the TV's flicker calls louder than the quiet voice inside telling us we could be doing something else. It's in the doing, not just the wanting. It's in the small, uncomfortable choices, repeated until they become part of you. And most of us, well, we're just too damn tired or too damn comfortable, or maybe, if we're being brutally honest with ourselves, too damn lazy to pick up the shovel and start digging that garden day in and day out. We want the harvest, but we don't want to get our hands dirty. We want the easy way, the shortcut, the one-time fix. But the easy way don't build nothing lasting. It don't build strong bones or a keen mind or a life that stands tall against the wind. What builds that? That's what we usually run from. Take Frank Miller, for instance. Frank, 48 years old, and every one of those years, especially the last 3 decades, felt etched deep into the calluses on his palms, into the worn lines around his eyes. He was a factory man, through and through, the kind of man you'd find hunched over a grinding machine, coated in metal dust and the faint, acrid tang of lubricants, day in and day out. Harmon's gear and axle had been his second home since he was barely out of high school. You wouldn't find a softer, cleaner pair of hands on Frank than you would on a blacksmith's anvil. They were scarred, thick-knuckled, always a bit rough, and often stained with grease that seemed to seep deeper than the surface, becoming part of the man himself, a silent testament to a life spent making things, enduring things. He wasn't much for small talk, Frank wasn't. Not on the factory floor, where the noise made anything but shouting pointless, and certainly not at the corner store or the rare family barbecue. He'd give you a quick nod, maybe a gruff "Mornin'." If you caught his eye, but his gaze, a faded blue beneath thick, often furrowed brows, was usually scanning, observing, taking everything in without giving much back. Some folks thought he was cold, maybe even a bit unapproachable. And perhaps on the surface he carried that stoic air. But if you looked closer, really peered past the tired lines that webbed out from the corners of his eyes, past the way his shoulders slumped slightly after a 10-hour shift, you'd see a flicker. A spark that hadn't quite gone out, a stubborn ember beneath layers of exhaust and fatigue. That spark was fueled by his family. It was for Sarah, his wife, who'd shared every single one of those 48 years with him, seen him through lean times and the occasional, brief good ones, through layoffs and endless overtime. It was for Jake, their 19-year-old, grappling with community college and trying to figure out his path. And for Emily, 16, sharp as a tack and dreaming bigger, brighter dreams than Frank ever dared to voice for himself. They were his world, his anchor, his unchanging reason for punching in before the sun rose, day after relentless day. He carried them not just in his heart, but in the quiet weight of his daily choices, in the way he picked up extra shifts when the bills piled up, in the way he fixed anything that broke around their modest, well-kept single-story house. He was a rock, unwavering in his commitment to provide, to protect. But beneath that granite exterior, a different kind of burden had settled in, heavier and more insidious than any heavy box he lifted at work. A quiet, persistent doubt about his own potential. He was good at work, damn good. He showed up, he pushed, he persevered when the machines broke down or the quotas seemed impossible, when the supervisors breathed down his neck. But when it came to himself, to his own growth or happiness beyond the factory gates, he tended to underestimate. He was a man of action, but only within the familiar, deep grooves he had carved out for himself. Those grooves were safe, familiar, even if they sometimes felt like ruts. He'd accepted his lot, believed hard work alone was enough, and when he'd occasionally tried a new hobby or a healthy change, a fishing trip that ended in frustration, a gym membership that saw only a handful of visits, they'd always fizzle out. Each failure reinforced a quiet, persistent belief. He just was that kind of person. Too tired, too busy, too set in his ways. Too lazy, if he was truly honest with himself, to commit to the daily grind of self-improvement outside the 4 walls of the factory floor. There's a kind of man you meet, sometimes, at the crossroads of life. He's not lost, not exactly, but he's standing still, watching the world rush by, wondering if there was ever another road he might have taken. He's the kind of man who measures his days in blisters and calluses, who understands the honest ache of muscles well used, but who's forgotten the sharper, more insidious pain of a dream left unchased. He's convinced himself that his path was chosen for him, set in stone the moment he punched his first clock, and that the only honor left was to walk it with quiet dignity, no matter how much his feet hurt. He's a good man, a hardworking man, but he carries a silent burden. The weight of his own unspoken potential, buried under the practicalities of earning a living. He sees the ambitious ones, the ones who seem to have a different gear, and a part of him dismisses them, another part envies them, but mostly he just thinks, "That ain't for me." Our man, he wasn't some fictional hero in a book, just Frank. 48 years old, and every one of those years etched into his frame like the grain in old timber. He worked at the same plastics factory for nearly 3 decades, the kind of place where the air always smelled faintly of burnt chemicals and the rhythmic clang of machinery was the soundtrack to your life. You could pick him out of a lineup of 100 factory men. He wasn't particularly tall, but his shoulders were broad, slightly stooped from years of lifting, carrying, and pushing, yet still powerful. His hands, though, they told the real story. Knobby knuckles, scarred by molten plastic and sharp edges, calloused beyond belief, the nails permanently grimed beneath, no matter how much he scrubbed. They were the hands of a man who built, who repaired, who provided. His face was a roadmap of a working life. Lines fanned out from the corners of his eyes, etched deeper by sunlight, exhaust fumes, and too many mornings waking before dawn. There was a permanent shadow of fatigue under those eyes, but they were still observant, quiet, taking in more than he let on. Sometimes, especially when he was watching Jake play baseball or Emily drawing, there was a flash of something else in them, a glint of pride, a flicker of longing quickly banked. He usually appeared gruff, unapproachable, like a worn-out machine that still functioned perfectly but didn't invite unnecessary interaction. He didn't waste words, preferring to let his actions speak or more often to let silence do the talking. But beneath that stoic exterior, you could sense the deep-seated hope for his family, a quiet fire that never truly went out, even when the rest of him felt like ashes. The hope was a strange thing, a persistent ember in the ash-filled grate of his daily existence. Because mostly his days were a carefully orchestrated rhythm of necessity, a drumbeat of routine that started precisely at 5 in the morning. Not 5:01, not 4:59. 5. The digital glow of the alarm clock, a stark red rectangle in the pre-dawn darkness, announced the beginning of another cycle. Sarah was often already a shadow in the kitchen, making coffee, their movements a silent, practiced dance around each other, words unnecessary. He'd shower, letting the hot water sluice away the last vestiges of sleep, though never quite the weariness. Then coffee, black and strong, the kind that tasted like ambition for those who had it, and pure function for those who just needed to get going. The drive to the plant was a blur of streetlights and other anonymous headlights, the same route he'd taken for nearly 30 years. He knew every pothole, every turn, every shortcut instinctively. At the gate, the guard would offer a grunt of acknowledgement, not a hello, just a recognition of another day, another face in the endless procession. Inside the factory, the air was thick with the metallic tang of machinery, a symphony of grinding, stamping, and hissing that had long since stopped being noise and had become the very fabric of his consciousness. His station, Line 3, Section B. He operated a press that shaped raw plastic into various components, endless streams of identical parts, day in, day out. His hands, those calloused, strong hands, moved with an almost robotic precision, feeding the machine, extracting the finished product, checking for flaws. Repetition was a comfort, a prison, both at once. It required just enough attention to keep him from drifting too far, but not so much that it engaged his mind. His body would ache by midday, a dull throb in his lower back, a stiffness in his shoulders, but he barely noticed it anymore. It was just Frank, his job, and the endless march of time towards the next break, then lunch, then the clock out. Lunch was a quick affair, often eaten alone or with a few workmates, exchanging terse comments about the boss, the weather, or the latest sports scores. His packed lunch, usually a sandwich and an apple, was fuel, not pleasure. Then back to the clamor, the heat, the smell. And then, finally, the punch-out. The sweet relief of stepping out into the late afternoon light, the cool air a balm on his sweat-damp skin. Evenings were for the family. Dinner with Sarah, Jake, and Emily. He'd try to listen to Jake talk about his community college classes or Emily recount her day at school, but sometimes the exhaustion was a physical weight, pressing down on his eyelids, clouding his thoughts. He wanted to be present, truly present, but the grind had a way of hollowing you out. After dinner, he'd sit in his worn armchair, the TV a muted background hum, while Sarah did the dishes and the kids retreated to their rooms. Sometimes he'd fix a leaky faucet, or help Jake with a problem on his old car, small acts of service that made him feel useful beyond the factory floor. The financial tightrope was a constant, unspoken stressor. The mortgage on their modest house, the car payments, Jake's tuition, Emily's occasional requests for new clothes or school trips. They were a relentless current, always threatening to pull them under. He never complained, never voiced the worry, but every unexpected bill, every rise in grocery prices felt like a direct hit. It wasn't about ambition for wealth. It was about survival, about providing, about not failing his family. He often found himself staring at the bills spread out on the kitchen table, the numbers mocking him with their indifference. Beneath all this, a deeper ache resided, a weariness of the spirit that went beyond tired muscles. Frank carried the quiet burden of buried dreams, faint echoes of a younger man, full of unformed ideas, who once imagined building houses, crafting furniture, working for himself, seeing the tangible results of his own vision from start to finish. He'd wanted to create, not just assemble. The Frank who stood on the factory floor, mindlessly feeding plastic into a machine, felt like a stranger to that hopeful young man. He'd traded the wild, unpredictable possibility of self-made success for the reliable, soul-crushing certainty of a steady paycheck. It was a sensible trade, he told himself, the responsible one. And yet the regret, a dull, persistent throb, was always there, reminding him of the gap between who he was and who he'd once dared to believe he could be. He'd watch Jake, still finding his way, bright but adrift, and see flashes of his own youthful self, full of potential, but also prone to that easy acceptance, that tendency to let things happen instead of making them happen. And it was then, in those quiet moments, that the true fear would surface, not just for himself, but for his son. He didn't want Jake to end up settling like he had. Not exactly. The true crack in Frank's quiet resignation didn't come with a bang, but with the sterile, hushed tone of Dr. Miller's office. It was a Tuesday, late afternoon, the kind of day when the factory whistle still rang in his ears, even hours after his shift ended. He sat on the crinkly paper of the examination table, the cuff squeezing his arm like a python, his heart thumping a rhythm that felt oddly out of sync. "Frank," Dr. Miller said, adjusting his glasses, his voice calm but firm, "we need to talk about these numbers." He tapped a chart with a pen. "Your blood pressure is up again, and your cholesterol. It's a concern. We've talked about this, haven't we?" Frank nodded, a tightness in his chest that wasn't just physical. He'd heard it before, little warnings over the years, easy to dismiss as just part of getting older. But this time, the doctor's eyes held a different kind of gravity. "You're a strong man, Frank, always have been. But you're pushing 49. Your body isn't an assembly line that just keeps going without maintenance. If we don't address this, we're looking at some serious risks down the road. Heart disease, stroke, you understand." He understood. He heard the words, saw the concern, but it was the image that flashed unbidden into his mind that truly landed the blow. Sarah alone, trying to manage everything, Jake and Emily, confused and hurting. The fear wasn't for himself so much as for the burden he might become. He left the office with a prescription for blood pressure medication and a brochure on diet and exercise. The brochure felt heavy, a damning indictment in his hand. He tossed it onto the passenger seat of his pickup, a wave of familiar lethargy washing over him. Too much work, too tired. Who has the time for all that? That old refrain, his constant companion. But then that evening, as he watched Jake slouched on the sofa, scrolling through his phone, vaguely complaining about a community college assignment he hadn't started, something clicked into place. Jake, bright kid, but drifting, full of excuses, full of "I'll get to it laters." Frank saw himself 20 years ago, 30 years ago. He saw the potential slowly eroding, the fire dimming. He told himself his passive approach was just a practical one, accepting reality. But now, seeing it mirrored in his son's inaction, it looked different. It looked like surrender. It looked like a lack of fight. And it wasn't just hurting him, it was setting an example, a bad one. He realized then that his excuses weren't just convenient lies to himself. They were an inheritance he was passing down. That night, Frank couldn't sleep. The clock radio glowed 3:17 a.m. Sarah was a soft presence beside him, her breathing even, oblivious to the turmoil raging in his head. He eased himself out of bed, careful not to wake her, and padded silently to the kitchen. The linoleum was cold under his bare feet. He poured himself a glass of water, the clink of ice cubes unnaturally loud in the silence. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd sorted bills, the same table where he'd seen Jake wasting time. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows through the window. Every single excuse he'd ever made for himself seemed to rise up, ghostly figures in the dim light. Too tired. But was he really? Or was he just too comfortable with being tired? No time, but he found time for endless hours in front of the TV, for beers after work that turned into 2, then 3. It's just the way I am. A lie, a convenient label to avoid trying. The doctor's words echoed. Serious risks down the road. And Jake's glazed-over eyes, apathy about his future. It wasn't just physical death the doctor warned about. It was a kind of slow, quiet death he was already living. A death of ambition, of energy, of possibility. He was a pillar of responsibility, yes, but a slowly crumbling one. He'd accepted his lot, but what exactly was his lot? A slow slide into ill health, into quiet resentment, into a life lived on autopilot. He thought about the young man who wanted to build things, who had dreams that felt real, tangible. That Frank would look at him now, a worn-out man with high blood pressure and a heavy heart, and he'd be disappointed. Not angry, just disappointed. He'd become the very thing he'd sworn he wouldn't be, someone who just let life happen to him. He'd mistaken hard work for meaningful living, exhaustion for effort. He saw the fear in his own resistance to change, the fear of failing if he actually tried. It wasn't laziness, not entirely. It was a deep-seated fear that if he truly pushed himself, truly tried for something more and still failed, that would be an even harder truth to bear. So he kept his head down, worked his hands, and let the years slip by. But tonight, in the brutal honesty of 3 a.m., the cost of that safety felt heavier than any risk. His life had become a rut deep and familiar, and he was terrified, truly terrified, that he would never climb out. But tonight, in the brutal honesty of 3 a.m., the cost of that safety felt heavier than any risk. His life had become a rut deep and familiar, and he was terrified, truly terrified, that he would never climb out. He lay there motionless, the rhythmic breathing of Sarah beside him, the only sound in the quiet house. Outside, the sky was just starting to lighten, a faint gray bleeding into the black. He didn't move, didn't sigh, didn't clench his fists. There was just a slow, quiet settling in his gut, a hard knot of certainty forming. The word didn't escape his lips, but it resonated through every tired bone in his body, clear as a bell. Enough. It wasn't a sudden burst of inspiration or a grand plan descending from the heavens. It was a weary, bone-deep surrender to the truth. He didn't know what came next, didn't have a roadmap or a secret formula. All he knew was that the old path, the one he'd been on, was leading nowhere good. It was just a different kind of falling, and he was done with it. That quiet decision, made in the hushed gray light before dawn, felt heavier than any decision he'd made in years. It wasn't about wanting to be rich or famous. It was about not wanting to disappear. The alarm clock blared at 5 a.m., just like every other workday. But today, the sound hit Frank differently. Usually, it was a dull thud, a signal to groan and resent the new day. This morning, it was an unwelcome challenge, a direct confrontation with the quiet promise he'd made himself hours earlier. The old Frank would have smacked the snooze button, burrowed deeper under the covers, and found a dozen reasons why an extra 10 minutes of sleep was critical. You're too tired. You have a long day ahead. What difference will it even make? It's too dark. It's too cold. The excuses were old friends, comforting whispers promising ease. They were the very reason most folks stayed stuck, he realized, the siren song of immediate comfort lulling them into a lifetime of quiet regret. But the new Frank, the one forged in the crucible of a sleepless night and a doctor's stark warning, lay there, listening to those whispers, and for the first time truly saw them for what they were. Just noise. He didn't feel motivated. He felt exactly how he always did at 5 a.m., heavy, groggy, longing for sleep. But something else was present now, a stubborn, almost angry resolve. He swung his legs out of bed, his feet hitting the cold linoleum with a jolt. He stood by the window, peering out into the still dark street. His old sneakers sat by the door, worn and comfortable, usually reserved for mowing the lawn. He picked them up, his fingers fumbling with the laces. Every fiber of his being screamed to just make coffee, sit down, and scroll through the news. That familiar, tempting laziness clawed at him, promising the simple pleasure of inaction. But he pushed it back. Just get out the door, Frank. Just do that. Stepping outside, the cold morning air hit him like a slap, sharp and unwelcome. He pulled his thin jacket tighter. The world was utterly silent, save for the distant hum of traffic on the highway. He felt foolish out there in the dark, What was he even doing? A 30-minute walk, 30 minutes. It felt like an eternity. His joints ached with the cold. His calves felt tight before he even started. The little voice piped up again, louder this time. Go back inside. This is pointless. You're not a morning person. This isn't you. He ignored it. He focused on the faded streetlights ahead, on the cracked pavement beneath his feet, one foot in front of the other. The first 5 minutes were pure misery. His lungs burned, his legs felt heavy, and his mind drifted back to the warmth of his bed. He wanted to quit. He almost did. He thought about turning around, retreating to the familiar, to the easy path he knew so well. But then he pictured Jake's uninspired face, the doctor's serious eyes. He pictured the man he wanted to be, the man he should have been all along. He kept walking. It wasn't a fast walk, not yet. More of a determined shuffle. He focused on his breath, on the rhythm of his steps. After 10 minutes, a tiny shift. The burning in his lungs eased slightly. The initial stiffness in his legs began to loosen. The darkness around him started to lift, the sky above him a canvas slowly lightening from deep indigo to a bruised purple. He saw a few other souls now, shadowy figures in the distance, also out walking, running, living their lives before the world fully woke up. They weren't special. They were just people who chose to do the uncomfortable thing. He didn't feel good, not exactly. But he didn't feel bad either. He just felt present, connected to the effort. When he finally reached his own street again, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold, he checked his old Timex watch. 28 minutes. Close enough. He hadn't conquered the world. He hadn't solved any grand problems. But he had faced down the comfortable devil of his own inertia, and for the first time in a long time he hadn't backed down. He unlocked his front door, the click echoing in the quiet house, and felt a tiny, fragile spark flicker within him. Not of triumph, but of quiet defiance. He had shown up. And that, he was beginning to understand, was the whole damn point. The next morning, the alarm's buzz felt less like a quiet call and more like a drill sergeant's bark. Every muscle in Frank's legs, shoulders, and even his damn forearms screamed in protest. It was the good kind of sore, the kind that reminded you you'd actually done something, but it was still sore. His bed, with its warm, familiar embrace, felt like the most inviting place on earth. The thought of stepping out into the pre-dawn chill, of forcing his tired body through another half-hour march, was almost unbearable. Just roll over, Frank, a sneaky voice whispered in his ear, sounding suspiciously like his own. One day won't matter. You're still sore. Rest up. He squeezed his eyes shut. He pictured the doctor's warning again, the subtle sag in Jake's shoulders. He pictured the easy path, the one he'd trod for years and knew where it led. Nowhere new. With a groan that vibrated deep in his chest, he swung his legs over the side of the bed. The cold floor was a shock, a jolt of unwelcome reality. He dressed quickly, the movements stiff, each buttoning a minor victory. Out on the street, the air bit sharp, but he recognized the familiar chill now. He kept his pace steady, his eyes fixed on the pavement just ahead, just putting one foot in front of the other. The walk was harder today, a grind, but he finished it. Back inside, gulping down a glass of water, he felt the tiny spark again, a little stronger now, less fragile. He packed his healthy lunch, turkey, whole wheat, an apple, some carrots. The smell of Sarah's leftover bacon from breakfast was a brutal test, but he swallowed hard and resisted. That evening after dinner, the book waited on his nightstand. His eyes felt heavy, his mind foggy from the day's work. The TV was calling, a comfortable numb. But he picked up the book, The Power of Habit. Dry stuff, some might say, but he found himself reading, a slow, deliberate crawl through paragraphs. 15 minutes. He almost drifted off once or twice, but he pushed through. Day 3 was a repeat, only the internal arguments were louder. Day 5, the rain came, a cold, relentless drizzle. The thought of walking in that felt like an insult. He stood by the window, watching the drops smear down the glass, a genuine reason, a perfect excuse. See, can't walk today? Mother Nature's telling you to take a break. He almost believed it, almost, but then he grabbed his old rain jacket, the hood pulled tight, and stepped out anyway. The cold rain was a shock, but the sensation of it on his face, mixing with the sweat, felt. Honest, real, he came back soaked, but with a stubborn pride humming in his veins. The lunches were a constant battle. The factory breakroom was a minefield of processed snacks, greasy takeout containers, and sugary sodas. Frank watched his buddies devouring their usual fare, heard their good-natured ribbing. "What's with the rabbit food, Frank? Training for a marathon?" He'd just grunt, chewing his bland, healthy meal. One day, the smell of fresh-baked donuts from the corner store that someone brought in was almost too much. He stared at his apple, then at the box of glazed temptation. His hand hovered. Just one? Nobody would know. He could just, nah, he mumbled, pushing his plate away. The craving gnawed at him, a dull ache, but he fought it down. Around day 14, the sheer monotony became the biggest enemy. The physical aches had dulled somewhat, replaced by a deep-seated weariness of spirit. Every morning felt like climbing the same mountain, every lunch felt like resisting the same siren song, every evening felt like pushing the same rock uphill. He questioned everything. What's the point? Is this even making a difference? I'm still Frank, punching a clock, trying to make ends meet. There were no sudden epiphanies, no magic transformations, just the relentless, quiet insistence of the routine. He'd wake up some mornings feeling absolutely dead, his body a lead weight. He'd want to curse, to throw the alarm clock against the wall, to just go back to sleep, to that comfortable oblivion. One evening, tired beyond measure, he sat down with his book, but his mind refused to focus. He read the same sentence 3 times, the words blurring. He felt the familiar pull of the TV, a mindless show promising escape. He sighed, the sound heavy in the quiet room. To hell with it, he muttered, tossing the book onto the table. He reached for the remote. But his hand stopped. It hovered there just an inch from the power button. He looked at the book, then at his reflection in the dark TV screen. A tired, defeated man. Was this it? Was this where he folded? Was this where he proved that he just was that kind of person? He thought of Jake again, of the example he was trying to set, not just in words, but in action. He thought of Sarah, who deserved better than a husband who gave up on himself. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled his hand back from the remote. He picked up the book again. He didn't read. He just held it. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and opened them again. He started from the beginning of the paragraph. This time he focused. He understood. It wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence. It was about showing up even when the internal resistance felt insurmountable. It was about doing the damn thing, even when you didn't want to, especially when you didn't want to. He was still battling every single day against the gravity of his old self, against the comfortable lure of the easy way. But each time he chose the hard path, even a small, uncomfortable step, a small, new pathway was being forged within him, deeper and stronger. The weeks that followed were a testament to the quiet, relentless power of showing up. Day after day, Frank laced up his worn sneakers, the early morning chill a familiar sting, not a deterrent. Day after day, he packed his modest, healthier lunch, the thought of the vending machine's empty calories losing its appeal. And night after night, he opened that book, sometimes dog-tired, sometimes needing to reread a paragraph, but always pushing through those 15 minutes. The internal battles didn't vanish entirely, but they grew weaker, replaced by a new kind of quiet strength, a bedrock of internal knowing that he could, in fact, do this. Then one morning, something shifted. It wasn't a sudden light switch, more like the slow rise of the sun, barely noticeable at first. He finished his walk, his breath steady, and realized he wasn't just doing it, he was feeling it. A lightness in his stride, a clarity in his head. Sarah noticed it first over breakfast. "You're humming, Frank," she said, a gentle smile playing on her lips. "Haven't heard you hum in years." He hadn't even realized it. Jake, usually glued to his phone, looked up one evening. "Dad, what's that book you're always reading?" Looked serious. Frank actually smiled, a genuine, unforced smile. He found himself explaining a concept from the chapter, something about compound interest, not just in money, but in effort. Jake listened, really listened. Emily, often lost in her own teenage world, started joining him for short walks after dinner sometimes, not because she had to, but because she saw the energy he carried, the calm steadiness. His co-workers at the factory started noticing too. Less grumbling during the early shifts, a clearer focus on the line. He still worked hard, but the exhaustion that had once settled deep in his bones, the kind that dimmed his eyes, had begun to recede. Wasn't skipping breaks, but he wasn't dragging himself to the vending machine for a sugar hit either. He was simply more present, more frank, but a better version. He remembered the doctor's warning, the trigger that had set this whole thing in motion. A few months later, at his follow-up, the doctor blinked at the charts. "Well, Frank," he said, tapping a pen, "your numbers are looking a lot better. Blood pressure's down, cholesterol's improved. What exactly have you been doing?" Frank just smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. "Just been showing up, Doc, that's all." His life wasn't suddenly glamorous. He wasn't lounging on a beach somewhere or driving a fancy new car. The factory still called at 5 a.m., the bills still arrived, and life still threw its curveballs. But Frank, the man who used to see only the faded walls of his existence, now saw the sturdy foundation he was building, brick by painful, consistent brick. He still had doubts sometimes, still felt the pull of the old, easy ways. But now he also had an anchor. He had the quiet confidence that came from proving to himself day after day that he could choose the harder path. He understood now. It wasn't about some secret formula or a magic pill you swallowed. It was about those little uncomfortable choices repeated without fanfare day in and day out. Most people, he realized, they wanted the result without the repetition. They wanted to be healthier, smarter, more successful, but they weren't willing to put in the lonely, unglamorous work. They called it too busy, too tired. Not for me. But Frank knew the truth of it deep down in his bones. It wasn't about capability. It was about consistent effort. It was about choosing to get up and do the thing, even when the voice inside screamed for comfort, for escape, for just a little more sleep. Most folks, they were just too lazy to adopt the discipline required, to earn the quiet confidence that came from showing up for yourself every single damn day. And Frank, a man who once believed he wasn't that kind of person, had become exactly that kind of person. He was still Frank, the factory man with the worn hands and quiet strength. But his eyes held a new light, a spark of hope that reflected not just in his own life, but in the growing determination he saw in his son's eyes and the newfound curiosity in his daughter's. He hadn't changed the world, but he had changed his world,